Michael had always been the kind of person who believed in helping others, even in small ways. A firm believer in the power of community, he often donated blood at the local center. It was a simple act of kindness he could give to those in need, and today was no different. He walked through the sliding glass doors of the busy blood donation center, his mind set on doing his part to help save lives. The bustling lobby, with people waiting to donate, didn't faze him. He'd been here many times before. The receptionist, a woman in her early 30s with blonde hair tied in a tight bun, looked up from her computer as Michael approached the desk. She gave him a polite, if somewhat distracted, smile. But Michael noticed something odd in her eyes. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was a shift in her demeanor, something that didn't sit right. Still, he greeted her warmly, a small smile on his face. "Hi. I'd like to donate blood today," Michael said, his voice calm and friendly. The receptionist didn't respond immediately. She glanced at him, then back at her computer screen, typing something quickly. There was a brief silence before she looked up again, her smile now tinged with something that felt less genuine. "Just a moment," she said, her tone colder than before. She quickly printed out a form and slid it across the desk. "Fill this out and I'll get someone to take you in," she added, her eyes not meeting his. Michael frowned but said nothing. He had learned to ignore awkwardness in situations like this before, but there was something about her reaction that felt wrong. He took the form, sat down in the waiting area, and filled it out as best as he could. When he finished, he returned it to the desk, expecting the usual warm reception. Instead, the receptionist looked at it, then back at him, before returning her attention to the computer screen, completely ignoring him. Michael stood there for a moment, waiting for further instructions. When she still didn't acknowledge him, he cleared his throat and leaned slightly over the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem with the form? Or—" "Oh no, no problem at all," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. She gestured for him to follow her to the nurse's station. Michael was too polite to push the issue, but the feeling of unease was growing. He followed her down the hallway into the back room where the nurses usually prepared the donors. The walls were a sterile white, and the smell of antiseptic hung in the air. A nurse, middle-aged with short red hair, was talking with a colleague. When she saw Michael, she straightened up and smiled, but there was something off about the way her eyes lingered on him. "Hello," Michael greeted her, trying to shake off the tension building in his chest. "Hello," she responded, but her smile was cold, almost forced. "I see you'd like to donate." "Yes," Michael said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I've donated here before. I just wanted to do my part, you know." The nurse nodded slowly, but she didn't immediately move to prepare him for donation. Instead, she took a step back, glancing at the receptionist, who had followed him into the room. The receptionist gave a subtle nod, which Michael couldn't help but notice. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, sensing something wasn't right. "You know," the nurse began, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "we have a specific policy here. Some people aren't the best candidates for donation, especially in certain circumstances." Michael blinked, not quite sure if he had heard her right. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, his voice even, trying to keep his confusion in check. The nurse hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say. "Well," she said, as though choosing her words carefully, "there are studies that show people from certain ethnic backgrounds, shall we say, can have blood that isn't as compatible with certain patients." Michael's eyes widened. "Are you saying that my blood isn't good enough?" The nurse faltered, suddenly unsure of herself. "Well, it's not that it's not good enough," she said, floundering. "It's just that there are concerns about it being incompatible with others." The receptionist stood silent behind him, her arms crossed, looking almost smug, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Michael felt his jaw tighten. He knew what was happening. He had experienced moments of subtle racism before, but never this blatant. His mind raced, but he stayed calm. "So, you're refusing to let me donate based on my race?" The nurse, now visibly uncomfortable, opened her mouth to speak, but Michael raised a hand to stop her. "I've donated here before. My blood type hasn't changed." "You've accepted it in the past," he said, his voice still calm but laced with frustration. The nurse opened and closed her mouth several times, looking for an excuse. But Michael didn't wait for her to come up with one. He stood straight and gave her a polite smile, but inside, his anger simmered. "I'll wait for the supervisor," Michael said, turning and walking back out into the waiting area. As he left the room, he could feel the eyes of both the receptionist and the nurse on him, but he didn't look back. He was determined to find out exactly what was going on here and to make sure their prejudice wouldn't go unchecked. Michael stood outside the nurse's station, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. It was hard to believe that in this day and age, he was still being treated like this. He had come to donate his blood, a simple act of kindness, and instead, he was being subjected to the kind of racism that felt like a slap in the face. He could feel his heart beat faster, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He wouldn't let them get the best of him, not today. He glanced around the waiting area. The usual mix of donors sat quietly, filling out their forms or talking softly amongst themselves. No one seemed to be paying attention to him, which was a small comfort. He walked over to a chair and sat down, waiting for the supervisor to come, hoping they would address the situation fairly. After a few minutes, the nurse, still flustered from their earlier exchange, came out from behind the station. She looked around as though avoiding eye contact with Michael, her hands nervously fidgeting with a clipboard. She paused at the receptionist's desk and said something quietly to her before turning to face Michael. I'm sorry about the misunderstanding, she said, her tone stilted. It's just that. We have strict guidelines about who can donate and who can't, and Michael stood up, his patience thinning. He was tired of the apologies that weren't apologies at all. Misunderstanding? He repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. You just told me my blood wasn't good enough because of my race, and now you're calling it a misunderstanding? The nurse's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but Michael cut her off before she could say anything further. No, he said, his voice firm. You don't get to do that. You don't get to just sweep this under the rug, and you certainly don't get to tell me that my blood is somehow inferior. You need to call your supervisor now. The nurse took a step back, clearly uncomfortable, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned away. Michael could see the receptionist watching him from her desk, her eyes narrowed, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. There was a smug look on her face, and Michael's blood boiled at the thought that she, too, might be complicit in this. Within moments, the supervisor appeared, a middle-aged woman with short brown hair and a no-nonsense look on her face. She walked briskly toward him, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto Michael. Sir, the supervisor said, her voice polite but laced with a hint of irritation. Is there a problem? Michael could hear the underlying question in her tone. What's this all about? Why are you making a scene? I was told I can't donate because of my race, Michael replied, his voice level. I need to speak to you about what just happened. The supervisor's brow furrowed. She glanced over at the nurse and receptionist, both of whom avoided her gaze. The tension in the room grew thick as the nurse nervously fidgeted with a stack of papers. I'm sorry, the supervisor said, finally turning her attention back to Michael. But that's not our policy here. Let me get this straight. You were told you couldn't donate because of your race. Her tone grew more serious, but there was still a hint of disbelief in her voice. Is that correct? Michael nodded, his frustration barely contained. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I've donated blood here before, and now suddenly, my blood's incompatible with the needs of the center just because I'm black. That's not only ridiculous, it's discriminatory. The supervisor looked over at the nurse and receptionist again, and for the first time, Michael saw the nurse look genuinely nervous, shifting from foot to foot. The receptionist was still standing with her arms folded, not making any attempt to speak up. I'll need to look into this, the supervisor said, taking out her phone and tapping on it quickly. I'm going to call in a manager, and we'll get this sorted out right away. Please stay here, and I'll be right back. Michael didn't trust that this situation would be resolved as easily as the supervisor seemed to think. He had seen enough instances of racism disguised as policy to know that it might take more than a quick phone call to fix this. But he didn't want to make a scene, not yet, anyway. He simply nodded and took a seat, his eyes on the nurse and receptionist as the supervisor walked off. The nurse, still visibly uncomfortable, began to pack up the area, as though she hoped the situation would just disappear. The receptionist, on the other hand, stood still, her arms still crossed, her eyes glued to the floor. Michael could feel the weight of their disdain, and for a moment, he wondered how many others had come through this center and faced the same treatment. How many had left without saying anything? How many had simply accepted being discriminated against? The thought made his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let them win by making him angry. He had to stay focused. He was going to make sure this didn't go unnoticed, not for him, and not for anyone else who might come through this center in the future. The supervisor returned shortly, now accompanied by a man in a suit, a manager, Michael assumed. The manager was looking at his phone, and when he looked up at Michael, he seemed to be sizing him up, as if he were deciding how to handle this problem. Well, the manager said, folding his arms, I understand there's a misunderstanding. Let's get this cleared up. Michael stood up, his eyes meeting the manager's with determination. It's not a misunderstanding. This is about racism, and it's unacceptable. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but Michael didn't give him the chance. I want this to be addressed properly, he said. I don't care how long it takes. This is about more than just me. It's about everyone who comes here and gets turned away for something that isn't even a real issue. The room fell silent. The nurse and receptionist exchanged nervous glances. The supervisor's face softened, but she said nothing. Michael wasn't going to back down. He couldn't afford to. The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Michael stood firm, his posture straight, eyes locked on the supervisor, who seemed to be wrestling with what to do next. The manager, still standing there with his arms crossed, remained silent, perhaps unsure of how to address the gravity of the situation. The receptionist, on the other hand, kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her arms still tightly folded as if to shield herself from Michael's piercing stare. Michael had never felt so exposed and vulnerable, yet so resolute in his life. He had come here with the intention of helping, and now he was faced with an unjust refusal based on something as absurd and rooted in ignorance as the color of his skin. It angered him deeply, but he knew that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm his nerves. I've been calm this entire time, he said, his voice steady but firm. But this has gone on long enough. It's not just about me. It's about everyone who might be turned away for the same reasons. And I'm not going to let you sweep this under the rug. The manager looked over at the nurse and receptionist. Their uncomfortable silence told him everything he needed to know. Finally, he looked back at Michael, though he didn't seem entirely convinced by what he was hearing. Michael could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. I'll look into it, the manager said after a long pause. But in the meantime, we need to focus on a very urgent matter. A critical patient is waiting for a specific blood type. We've got a shortage of the right match, and we're in a very precarious situation. We need donations, and we need them now. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The news was a stark reminder of the very reason he had come here in the first place, to help. And yet, here he was, being rejected for something as trivial as his race. But then, the words from the manager clicked in his mind. Wait a minute, Michael said, his eyes narrowing. You need a specific blood type? Which one? The manager paused, clearly surprised by Michael's sudden shift. AB negative, he said, looking at a chart in his hands. It's rare, but the hospital is calling for it. We've had a few donors back out, and it's making things difficult for the team. Michael's mind was already working. He knew his blood type was AB negative. It was rare, yes, but it was precisely what the center needed. It seemed like fate had intervened in the most unexpected way. Let me donate, Michael said, his voice cutting through the tension. I have AB negative blood. It's exactly what you need. The nurse and receptionist both exchanged glances, and Michael could see the hesitation in their eyes. The nurse's hand went instinctively to the clipboard in her hands, clearly reluctant to acknowledge his offer. But she said nothing. The manager looked at Michael for a moment, his face unreadable. Well, he said, still reluctant. Let's see if we can get this sorted out then. I'll have someone prepare the donation area for you. Michael's jaw clenched, but he fought the urge to speak out again. He couldn't believe what was happening. After all the tension and accusations, here they were, on the verge of accepting his blood donation only because it was needed to save a life. The irony was too much to swallow. As the manager turned to instruct the nurse, Michael didn't back down. I want a full apology, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. This needs to be addressed, and I won't just walk out of here without it. The nurse looked as though she might protest again, but Michael's gaze was unwavering. He wasn't going to back down, not when the lives of others could be affected. Not when he knew, deep down, that this fight wasn't just his to win. It was for anyone who had ever been unfairly turned away or mistreated because of their race, their blood type, or any other reason. The nurse and the receptionist exchanged another uncomfortable glance, but the manager, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded in agreement. We'll take care of it, he said reluctantly. But please understand, we are in a tight spot here. I understand, Michael said, but his voice held no trace of apology. Just don't let this happen again. As Michael walked toward the donation area, the nurse followed reluctantly, and the receptionist continued to watch him from a distance, her arms still folded in defiance. But Michael didn't care. He had done what he needed to do. The donation process was quick, and he could feel the cold needle as it slid into his arm, the blood flowing into the bag. As he lay back, waiting for the procedure to finish, Michael felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the injustice he'd faced, despite the discrimination, he was doing what he had set out to do in the first place, helping. But little did he know, this donation would not only save the patient in need, it would shake the very foundation of the blood center's operations and force those who had tried to stop him to reckon with their own biases in a way they could never have predicted. The manager, still overseeing the procedure, couldn't quite hide his discomfort. He had witnessed how the situation had unfolded, and he knew that things had gotten out of hand. He had hoped it would be resolved quietly, but Michael's determination had forced him to confront the truth. The nurse and receptionist, standing to the side, exchanged glances once again. They were no longer in control of this situation. Michael had taken back the power by standing firm and refusing to be treated as anything less than a human being. As the final bag of blood was filled, Michael knew this was far from over. The fight for equality, for respect, was just beginning. But for now, all he could do was keep his focus on what mattered most, saving lives. And in that moment, that was enough. The room where Michael sat felt strangely quiet after the donation. The steady beep of machines, the rustle of papers, and the soft hum of the air conditioning were the only sounds filling the sterile space. He was still lying back in the reclining chair, his arm resting on the padded armrest as the final blood was drawn into the donation bag. The nurse who had reluctantly assisted him stood to the side, her face still pale and flushed with embarrassment. She glanced at him occasionally, but her eyes quickly darted away whenever their gazes met. Michael's mind was still racing. He hadn't expected his blood type to be the answer to the center shortage, but now, as he lay there, he realized something. It wasn't just his blood that was needed, it was his presence, his action, his willingness to stand up in the face of injustice. Even though it had taken far too long, he was finally taking control of a situation that should never have happened. He glanced up at the clock on the wall, noting the time. The nurse hadn't said much to him since the procedure started. The other staff members had gone silent as well, and Michael couldn't help but wonder if they were all waiting for the dust to settle so they could forget about the confrontation. But Michael wasn't going to let them forget. When the nurse finished packing away the donation equipment, she turned to him, looking as though she was about to speak. She opened her mouth but then quickly closed it, as if unsure of what to say. Finally, she sighed and walked toward the door to fetch the manager. Michael didn't need to be told what was coming. The center was clearly in damage control mode, and the management team would do whatever it took to avoid further scrutiny. As Michael sat up, he couldn't help but think about the situation from another angle. It wasn't just about him anymore. The center had made a mistake. No, a series of mistakes. They had let their racism color their judgment, and it had taken someone willing to stand up for what was right to make things right. He had seen how they acted toward him earlier, how quickly they dismissed him as not being good enough, based on nothing more than his race. They thought they could brush him off. But Michael had a different idea. This wasn't just about one man and one blood donation, it was about an entire system that needed to be held accountable. The nurse returned with the manager, who entered the room with a cautious look on his face. He offered a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The discomfort in the air was palpable as the door clicked shut behind them. "Thank you for your patience," the manager said, his voice polite but clearly tinged with tension. "I appreciate you staying through the donation despite the confusion earlier." Michael said nothing at first. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. The manager's eyes flicked nervously to the nurse, who stood behind him, shifting on her feet. The receptionist was nowhere to be seen now, likely hiding away in the back office, avoiding the fallout of her own actions. "We've reviewed the situation," the manager continued, though Michael could tell from his body language that he wasn't entirely comfortable. "I'll admit that the way you were treated was inappropriate, and I understand why you'd be upset." Michael's brow furrowed slightly. "You understand? But do you acknowledge that it was wrong? That I was turned away simply because of the color of my skin?" The manager hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. Yes, I understand now that it was a serious oversight, and the staff should have never acted that way. It was unprofessional and discriminatory. I can assure you that this will not happen again." Michael didn't reply immediately. His thoughts were swirling. The apology was hollow, but it was a start. The reality was, though, that the damage had already been done, not just to him, but to countless others who had likely experienced similar treatment over the years. How many people had walked out of this center, discouraged and dehumanized, their desire to help others rejected simply because of prejudice? I hope so, Michael said after a moment, his voice steady. But the issue goes beyond one incident. You can't just sweep this under the rug. You need to address the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. The manager seemed taken aback for a moment, but he nodded, clearly recognizing that Michael was right. We're going to implement more training on diversity and inclusion for all of our staff, and we'll make sure that our procedures are reviewed. This type of discrimination will not be tolerated. Michael's expression softened, though he didn't entirely believe the manager's words. He had heard promises like these before, only for them to fall through once the public outcry faded. But this time, he wasn't going to let them forget. Not this time. I'm glad to hear that, Michael said, standing up slowly and stretching his arms as the blood donation bag was sealed and placed aside. But it's not just about changing policies. It's about making sure your staff understands the consequences of their actions. You need to hold people accountable. The nurse, still standing off to the side, didn't speak a word. She simply looked down at the floor, avoiding Michael's gaze. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of her actions was finally beginning to hit her. But it was too little, too late. The manager took a deep breath and nodded. I hear you. I will make sure we take the necessary steps. And I'm truly sorry for the way you were treated. Michael gave a small nod, not entirely convinced. He didn't need their apologies. What he needed was for this situation to be the catalyst for real change. As he turned to leave the room, he was greeted by a different energy in the hallway. The staff seemed to avoid eye contact, almost as if they feared facing him after what had happened. But Michael wasn't there to make them comfortable. He was there to change the narrative, to force them to reckon with the truth. As he stepped out of the center and into the bright afternoon sunlight, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but today he had taken a stand. And that was the first step in a much larger journey. The day was drawing to a close, and the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Michael had barely left the parking lot of the blood center when his phone rang. He hesitated for a moment, his mind still buzzing with the conversation he'd just had with the manager. As much as he wanted to put the whole situation behind him, he knew deep down that the real work was only just beginning. The caller ID flashed with the blood center's number. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from them again so soon, but he answered the call nonetheless. Hello, he said, his voice cautious. Mr. Michael? The voice on the other end was the supervisor, and she sounded panicked. I'm so sorry to call you again, but we have a critical situation. The blood you donated, well, we're in desperate need of it right now. Michael felt his pulse quicken. What happened? I thought you had enough blood. There's a patient, an emergency case, the supervisor continued, her voice tight with urgency. The patient needs AB-negative blood specifically, and we're running low. The hospital called us for an immediate transfer. Your blood is the perfect match, and it's the only one we have left. Michael paused, taking in the gravity of the situation. He had never imagined that his blood donation would be needed so urgently. He could feel the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't just about the small act of kindness anymore. It was about saving someone's life. His blood had the potential to make a difference, to turn the tide in a life-or-death situation. Where do you need me to go? Michael asked, his voice now steady and calm. We've already prepared everything for the transfer. We just need your consent to use the blood, and we'll get it to the hospital immediately. I'll be there as soon as I can, Michael replied without hesitation. Just make sure everything's in place. After a few more quick instructions, the supervisor ended the call, and Michael quickly got back in his car, his mind racing. He drove back to the blood center, his thoughts swirling. He had come to the center to donate, to help, but now, his blood was the key to saving someone's life. It was a reminder of why he had fought so hard to stand up for his right to donate, even in the face of prejudice. As he pulled into the parking lot of the blood center once again, he saw a few staff members running around, preparing for the emergency blood transfer. The energy had shifted. It wasn't just a quiet, routine day at the center anymore. It was a race against time. When Michael entered the center, he was immediately escorted to a back room where his donation had been carefully stored. The nurse who had treated him earlier, still visibly uncomfortable, was standing by the counter, clearly unsettled by the chaos unfolding around them. I'm really sorry for everything that happened earlier, she said quietly, her voice apologetic but hesitant. She wouldn't meet his eyes, but the sincerity in her words was unmistakable. You're right. We never should have treated you that way. Michael looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. The apology, though it came late, was a step in the right direction. But he wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. It wasn't just about her. It was about the entire system that had failed him and countless others before him. But today, in this moment, it wasn't the time to dwell on the past. It was time to act. "It's okay," Michael said, his voice calm. "Just make sure this doesn't happen again. People's lives are on the line. That's what matters now." The nurse nodded, visibly relieved that Michael wasn't angry, but his words stuck with her. She knew in that moment that the change had to come from within, not just in policies or procedures, but in the attitudes of the staff, too. Within minutes, Michael's blood was carefully transferred into a bag, ready to be sent to the hospital. The center staff moved quickly, and the emergency transfer team arrived, taking charge of the situation with urgency. As the transfer was completed and the patient's blood was being sent off, Michael stood in the corner of the room, watching. The nurse who had initially rejected him came over to him once again, holding a clipboard in her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to fully express it, but thank you for not walking away." Michael gave a small smile, but he didn't say anything in response. The action, the act of helping, spoke louder than words could ever capture. He had made his point, not just by donating blood, but by standing his ground and refusing to let prejudice determine his worth. The hospital staff arrived moments later, and Michael overheard them discussing the patient. "The blood type match is perfect," one of the doctors said, relief evident in his voice. "We're going to save this patient. We're in the clear now." Michael felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet sense of pride. He had played a small but significant role in a life being saved. He had done more than just donate blood. He had ensured that the process of helping someone was never marred by racism or ignorance. His blood was not just acceptable, it was vital. As he left the center, the evening air felt different, lighter somehow. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, he had taken a stand, and the ripple effects of that stand were already starting to make a difference. The following days passed in a blur for Michael. He had gone from being just another donor to the center's most talked-about individual. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls, many of them from local media outlets asking for interviews or comments about the incident. But Michael wasn't interested in the attention. He had done what he felt was right, not for fame, but because he knew that standing up to injustice mattered. It was a week later when he received a call from the manager of the blood center. Michael had been expecting this call, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. "Mr. Michael," the manager said, his voice warm but still carrying a note of hesitation, "I wanted to personally thank you again for everything you did. Your blood donation saved a life, and for that, we are all extremely grateful." Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure how much more gratitude mattered. "I'm glad the patient made it. That's what matters," he said simply. The manager continued, his tone more serious now. "But there's something else I need to discuss. After a full investigation, we've taken immediate action. The nurse and receptionist who were involved in your case have both been terminated. They've been let go for their discriminatory actions. We've also brought in an external consultant to help us reevaluate our staff training and ensure that something like this never happens again." Michael's stomach twisted slightly at the news, but it wasn't a feeling of satisfaction. It was a reminder of the systemic failure that still existed in so many institutions. People had lost their jobs because of their actions, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. It wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about changing the culture. It was about making sure that everyone who walked into the center, no matter their race, was treated with respect and dignity. "That's a step in the right direction," Michael said after a pause. "But it can't end there. You have to make sure the staff understands why these changes are necessary. It's not just about following a policy, it's about treating people with human decency." "I understand," the manager responded, his voice sounding more genuine. "We're working on that. And we're going to start a public awareness campaign, too, about diversity, about inclusion, and about how anyone, regardless of race, is welcome here and can help save lives." Michael felt a small flicker of hope at the manager's words. There was still a long way to go, but the fact that the blood center was taking responsibility was something. He didn't expect everything to change overnight, but today it was enough. "I'm glad to hear that," Michael said. "But please don't just make it about this incident. Make it about everyone who's been turned away, everyone who's been made to feel inferior for no reason at all. That's the real change that needs to happen." The manager agreed. "We will. And Mr. Michael, I can't thank you enough for your courage and your grace in all of this. You made a huge impact." Michael didn't know what to say in response. It wasn't about thanks. It was about change, and he wasn't done yet. As he hung up the phone, Michael took a moment to reflect. He'd had doubts after the incident. He'd wondered if his efforts would even make a difference. But now, seeing the action that had been taken, he knew that standing up for what was right, no matter how small the victory, was worth it. The next morning, the local news station aired a story about the Blood Center's commitment to change, highlighting Michael's role in bringing the issue to light. The media coverage was not what Michael wanted, but it had an undeniable impact. People in the community started to talk about the donation, about racism in healthcare, and about the need to ensure equality for all. But perhaps the most profound change came when Michael received a letter from the hospital that had received the blood he had donated. The patient whose life had been saved wrote to him, thanking him for his generosity. The letter was heartfelt, humble, and full of gratitude. The patient, a woman named Carol, explained how she had been in a critical state and had feared for her life, but thanks to Michael's donation, she had received the blood she desperately needed. Reading her words, Michael was reminded of the power of kindness and the ripples that one small act of generosity could create. It wasn't just the blood he had donated. It was the courage to stand up to discrimination, to fight for equality, and to demand that people be treated fairly. And it wasn't just about one person's victory. It was about changing a system, one step at a time. In the weeks that followed, the Blood Center continued to implement the changes it had promised. They held community events, brought in guest speakers on diversity and inclusion, and worked with local organizations to ensure that everyone felt welcome. Slowly but surely, the Blood Center began to rebuild its reputation, and it became a model for other institutions looking to improve their policies. Michael continued with his life, but he carried the lessons from that experience with him. He knew that standing up for justice wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always popular. But it was always necessary. As for the nurse and the receptionist, they never returned to the center. Their careers were over because of their actions, but for Michael, their downfall wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. They had been given the opportunity to right their wrongs, but they chose not to. And in the end, Michael had proven what he had always believed, that one person, one small act of courage, could change the course of many lives.